always felt safe in my neighborhood. Elm Street is one of those quiet suburban places where you know most of your neighbors, and the biggest scare typically comes from raccoons knocking over trash cans at night. But that all changed last fall when something happened that still keeps me awake at night. It started with something small, almost mundane. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed that the light on my back porch was flickering. I figured it was just a bad bulb, something that could wait until the next day to fix. But when I checked the light in the morning, it was working perfectly again. The memory slipped from my mind until it happened again the next night. This time, the flickering seemed more deliberate. The light would flash off and on, almost like someone was playing with it. I stood by the back window, staring into the darkness beyond the porch, trying to catch a glimpse of anything out of place. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake this strange, creeping feeling that I was being watched. It sounds silly, but every nerve in my body was on edge. I brushed it off, told myself I was being paranoid. But over the next few nights, I started to feel a sense of dread every time I approached my back door. Then, one night, as I was watching a late-night show on TV, I got an alert on my phone. It was from the security camera app, movement detected on back porch. My heart pounded as I fumbled to open the app. When the feed loaded, it looked like there was no one there. I breathed a sigh of relief, chalking it up to maybe a stray animal. But just as I was about to close the app, something caught my eye. A faint outline of what looked like a person, right at the edge of the camera's range, near the back fence. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, or maybe a branch swaying in the wind. But as I squinted, trying to get a better look, I saw it move. Not swaying like a tree, but shifting slightly, as if someone was trying to stay out of sight. The figure was tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothing that blended into the shadows. My stomach twisted with fear. My first thought was to call the police, but I didn't want to overreact. Instead, I called Tom, my next-door neighbor and a close friend who liked to think of himself as our neighborhood's unofficial watchman. He was over in minutes, flashlight in hand, doing a sweep of my backyard while I watched nervously from the window. He didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone lurking. We talked it over, rationalizing it away. Maybe it was a prank, or some drifter passing through. But as he walked back to his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, that someone was out there, watching and waiting. The following night, I stayed up later than usual, watching TV with the volume turned low, half expecting another notification. The hours passed without incident, and I started to feel a bit silly. I almost convinced myself that it was all in my head, that maybe I had overreacted. But just as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed again. Movement detected on back porch. I felt a sickening sense of déjà vu as I opened the app. This time, the camera showed a much clearer view of the figure. They were standing closer, just under the porch light, and they weren't trying to hide. I could make out the shape of their head, shoulders, and long, thin limbs. Their face was obscured in shadow, but there was something deeply unsettling about their stance. Still, rigid, like they were waiting for something or someone. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, staring directly into the camera, as if they knew I was watching. My heart hammered in my chest as I dialed 911, barely able to get the words out to the operator. "There's someone on my porch. They're just standing there." The operator assured me that officers were on their way, and instructed me to stay inside with the doors locked. I watched the screen, gripping my phone so tightly that my hand ached. I thought about shouting at the person through the door, telling them to leave, but fear kept me rooted in place. The person on the porch didn't move a muscle, even as the flashing lights of a police car approached. Only when the officers pulled up did the figure retreat, slipping silently into the darkness beyond my yard. The police searched the area thoroughly but found no sign of anyone. One of the officers, a grizzled man with years of experience etched into his face, looked at me with sympathy. "Sometimes people get a kick out of scaring others," he said. "Let us know if anything else happens, but it might just be a prank." I nodded, but my instincts told me that this was no prank. After the police left, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I lay in bed, every sound amplified in the silence, wondering if my unwelcome visitor would return. For the next week, I took extra precautions. I upgraded my security system, installed motion-activated lights around the perimeter of my house, and even added another camera by the front door. Every night, I checked the feeds obsessively before going to bed. Nothing happened for a few days, and I started to believe that maybe the ordeal was over. Then a week later, I came home to find a small package on my doorstep. There was no return address, just my name scrawled on the top in messy, jagged handwriting. My hands shook as I picked it up, feeling a cold dread settle over me. I took the package inside, half tempted to throw it straight in the trash, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside the box was a single item, a light bulb. It looked old, with smudges and tiny cracks in the glass. My mind immediately went to the flickering light on my porch. Was this some kind of message? A twisted calling card? I felt sick to my stomach as I stared at it, realizing that this person wasn't just lurking. They were toying with me. I called the police again, but without any evidence of a crime, there was little they could do. The officer on the phone tried to reassure me, telling me to stay vigilant and call if anything else happened. But I knew that wasn't going to make me feel safe. From that night on, I kept every light on around my house. I triple-checked my locks, closed all the blinds, and barely slept. Every time I walked past a window, I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, as if someone was watching from the shadows just out of sight. Weeks went by, and there were no more sightings or mysterious packages. Slowly, I started to relax. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up to the faintest creak outside my window or catch a glimpse of something just at the edge of my vision. I still have that light bulb. I keep it in a drawer, a reminder that sometimes our deepest fears are closer than we'd like to believe. And every now and then, when I lie awake in the silence of the night, I wonder if one day I'll wake up to find that figure standing in my yard again, waiting under the flickering porch light. It was just another quiet Friday night, or at least that's how it started. After a long week, I was looking forward to a night in, catching up on a new show and ordering my favorite takeout. Living alone was still relatively new to me. I'd moved into my own place a few months back and I was enjoying the independence. I'd never been the paranoid type either. I felt safe in my little 2-bedroom house with a fenced backyard and motion sensor lights in the front. But this particular night, things were off. It was around midnight, and I was getting ready to go to bed. I just brushed my teeth when I heard a strange tapping sound. I froze, toothbrush halfway out of my mouth, listening. It was faint, but definitely there. A rhythmic, almost casual tap, tap, tap coming from somewhere at the front of the house. I'd never been jumpy, so I figured it might be a tree branch hitting the window or maybe something outside on the porch. But as I crept to the window and peeked out, the porch was empty. Nothing was swaying in the wind, and all seemed still. Shrugging it off, I finished getting ready for bed, convincing myself it was just a one-time thing. But just as I settled in, the tapping started again, louder this time. It wasn't a knock, more like someone or something tapping directly on the window glass. That's when I felt the first twinge of fear. I told myself it could just be a bird or some stray animal outside, hoping for food. I wanted to ignore it, go to sleep, and forget about it, but my gut told me to check the front door. So I tiptoed to the front hallway and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door just a crack and peeked outside. Nothing. The porch was empty, the street silent, not a soul in sight. I stepped back, closed the door, and double-locked it. As I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stood in my entryway, listening to the silence, wondering if I should call someone or just let it go. But then, just as I started to turn away, the motion sensor lights at the side of the house came on. That light only activated if something or someone moved in my side yard. My heart pounded as I watched the light spill across the yard through the window. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears to hear anything that might explain it. And then, I heard the faintest sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was trying to stay as quiet as possible. I grabbed my phone and turned on the security app that came with my cameras. I only had two, one in the front facing the street and another on the back porch, which had a view of the side yard as well. I switched to the back porch feed and saw nothing. Just the empty yard, bathed in the harsh white light from the motion sensor. I scanned the image, waiting, heart pounding. But after a moment, the light turned off. I started to relax, trying to brush it off as an overreaction. But just then, I saw something flicker at the edge of the camera's view. It was barely visible, like a dark blur at the corner, moving along the side of the house. I leaned closer, my breath catching, as I watched the figure move slowly out of sight, disappearing into the shadows. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but the thought of trying to explain this strange paranoia felt almost embarrassing. So instead, I went back to the living room and checked the locks again. My hand shook slightly as I bolted the door one last time, my eyes darting to the window. I decided to stay awake, just in case. I turned off the lights, sat down on the couch, and pulled out my phone, keeping one eye on the security feeds. Every little creak and whisper of wind outside seemed amplified in the silence. About 30 minutes passed, and just when I started to relax, I saw movement on the back camera again. This time, it wasn't a blur. It was a figure, tall, dressed in dark clothing, moving slowly along the edge of the yard. They were creeping towards the back door, their head turned as if to look through the windows. Panic surged through me. This wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone was actually there, lurking outside my house in the dead of night. I scrambled for my phone to call 911, but as soon as I dialed, my hand froze. The figure had stopped directly in front of the back door, and I could see them clearly now. They were holding something, a crowbar pressed close against their side as they inspected the lock on my door. My heart raced as I whispered my address to the dispatcher, praying they'd get here in time. I watched helplessly as the person lifted the crowbar, jamming it into the doorframe. I heard the faint creak from where I sat, and fear gripped me like a vice. I wanted to shout, to do something, but I was frozen with terror. The dispatcher stayed on the line, assuring me that officers were on their way, but all I could think about was the intruder slowly prying open my door. I held my breath as I watched them force it open, slipping inside with a careful, predatory quiet. I could see the silhouette moving through the kitchen, getting closer. I didn't know where to go. My mind raced with possibilities. The only hiding place I could think of was the coat closet near the front door, so I crept over as silently as I could, slipping inside and pulling the door shut behind me. I huddled there, my whole body tense, trying to control my breathing. The silence was agonizing. I heard footsteps coming down the hall, closer and closer. The intruder was moving deliberately as if they knew the layout of my house. I bit down on my knuckle to stop myself from making any noise. Every muscle in my body wound tight. Finally, I heard a faint shuffle right outside the closet door. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they wouldn't open it. The seconds felt like hours, and then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, I heard a loud voice from outside. "This is the police. Come out with your hands up." The intruder hesitated, then bolted back through the kitchen, slamming the back door as they fled. I burst out of the closet, rushing to the front door as the police entered. My legs were shaking as I let them in, barely able to speak. The officers searched the house, but the intruder was long gone. They assured me they'd patrol the area and take extra measures to ensure my safety, but I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, the terror of knowing someone had been inside my home, so close. After that night, I installed new locks, upgraded my security system, and started double-checking every door and window before bed. But the sense of security I once felt was gone. Every time I hear a strange noise or see a flicker on my cameras, my heart races, haunted by the memory of that night. I still don't know why they chose my house or what. I never thought it would happen to me. You always hear these horror stories about home invasions, read about them in the news, maybe know someone who knows someone. But I lived in a good neighborhood, quiet, friendly, the kind of place where you don't bother locking your car because it's always safe. But that sense of security, that belief that it can't happen to me, shattered one night. It was a night I'll never forget, a night that changed the way I view the world and my home. It was a Wednesday, and I'd been working late. My boss needed some last-minute revisions done, so I didn't get home until around 9:30. Exhausted, I threw together a quick dinner, then plopped down in front of the TV, half watching some show just to wind down. The house was dark, except for the soft glow of the TV. I felt safe, cozy. I never imagined that in less than an hour everything would change. As I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, I heard a sound. It was soft at first, a faint creak like the sound of a door easing open. My initial thought was that it was nothing, probably just the house settling. But then I heard it again, this time louder, more deliberate. I sat up, my senses suddenly alert. I muted the TV, holding my breath, straining to hear. The silence felt thick, heavy, and then there it was. Footsteps. Slow, cautious footsteps coming from somewhere at the back of the house. My heart pounded, each beat thudding louder than the last. I knew I'd locked the doors. I had a habit of double-checking every lock before bed, especially the back door. But the footsteps kept coming, soft but steady. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, to not make a sound. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to unlock it without making noise. But just as I was about to call 911, I heard voices. 2, maybe 3 of them. They were hushed, murmuring just loud enough for me to catch fragments. "Check the rooms, see if anyone's here. We don't have much time. We'll grab what we can." The voices were close, too close, and I felt my chest tighten. I was alone, completely outnumbered and unarmed. I didn't have a gun, no weapon, nothing to defend myself. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything I could use, but all I saw were cushions and magazines, nothing that would help against 3 intruders. The footsteps were moving down the hallway now, their shadows stretching under the door as they approached. My mind raced. If they found me, there was no way I could fight them off. I needed a plan, some way to get out of there before they reached me. I remembered the laundry room window. It was small, but if I could make it there without them noticing, I might be able to escape. Taking a deep breath, I stood up as quietly as I could, praying that the creak of the floor wouldn't give me away. But just as I took a step, my phone slipped out of my hand, hitting the floor with a loud thud. Silence. My heart stopped as I saw the shadows under the door freeze. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered, and suddenly the footsteps were heading straight toward the room I was in. I didn't have time to think. I bolted, racing down the hallway to the laundry room, praying I could make it before they saw me. I barely reached the laundry room when I heard the door behind me slam open. I glanced back, catching a glimpse of 3 men all dressed in black, their faces masked, standing in the doorway. They saw me, and for a second we just stared at each other, frozen. Then one of them lunged toward me, and I snapped out of my paralysis, throwing myself toward the window. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking as I tried to lift it. The footsteps were getting closer, their breaths heavy, angry. I managed to pry the window open just as one of them grabbed my arm, yanking me back with a force that made me stumble. I twisted, kicking and clawing, trying to break free, but he was too strong. His grip was iron, pinning me in place as the others closed in around me. I could see their eyes behind the masks, cold and calculating. I knew they weren't just here for my belongings. They wanted to make sure I didn't get out of this alive. Desperation took over. I swung my free hand wildly, managing to grab a nearby bottle of laundry detergent. Without thinking, I threw it in his face. The thick, sticky liquid splattered over his mask, and he let out a furious growl, loosening his grip just enough for me to pull away. I scrambled up onto the windowsill, squeezing through the narrow opening, feeling the rough edges of the frame scrape against my skin. Just as I slipped through, I felt a hand brush against my ankle, missing me by inches. I tumbled out onto the ground outside, the cold night air shocking me back into focus. I didn't stop. I sprinted across the yard, my bare feet hitting the wet grass as I ran toward my neighbor's house. I could hear the men shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding as they chased me. My lungs burned, every step feeling like an eternity as I raced toward the porch light glowing in the distance. I reached my neighbor's door and pounded on it, praying someone was home, that they'd hear me. Just as I heard the footsteps closing in, the door swung open, and my elderly neighbor, Mr. Johnson, stood there looking startled. "Please, help me," I gasped, pushing past him into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. He looked at me in shock. But before he could say anything, we heard the pounding on the door, the muffled voices of the men on the other side. Mr. Johnson, bless his heart, didn't waste a second. He grabbed his phone, calling the police while I hid behind him, shaking, barely able to process what had just happened. The men must have realized help was on the way because the pounding stopped, followed by the sound of footsteps fading into the night. When the police arrived, I was still in shock, barely able to explain what had happened. They searched my house, but the men were long gone, leaving nothing but a broken window and a few scattered belongings as evidence. They'd ransacked the place, looking for valuables, but it was clear they'd had another purpose too, one I didn't want to think about. That night changed everything for me. I'd never felt unsafe in my own home, but now I was haunted by the memory of those masked faces, those cold eyes watching me. I moved out a few weeks later, unable to stay in a place that no longer felt like home. Even now, in a new apartment with locks and security cameras, I still can't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Every creak, every shadow reminds me of that night. I keep a bat by my bed, check the locks obsessively, and never let my guard down. Because once you've seen what's out there, what people are capable of, you can never unsee it. And you learn that home isn't always the safe haven you thought it was.